Mid-1980s Victoria Palace Theatre, London. The ceiling's gold leaf glittered above silk gowns and decorated generals. Tonight's royal variety performance was governed by centuries-old protocol rules, dictating where everyone stood, when to look at Her Majesty, how loud voices could rise. But backstage, one man was preparing to crumple those rules like sheet music. Freddie Mercury stood before a full-length mirror, wearing a military-style jacket covered in bright yellow and gold embroidery, an outfit designed to mock every protocol it should have respected. Beside him, Brian May adjusted his own tie nervously. "Freddie, the palace advisors sent warnings," Brian said quietly. "They said we must be very careful when acknowledging the royal box. Not to go too far." Freddie winked at his reflection. "Darling, they may be expecting their own queen, but those thousands out there came to see theirs. Should I disappoint them?" What happened next, particularly the moment when a duke insulted Freddie's outfit and received a response that silenced an entire theater of aristocrats, became legendary. A lesson in how true royalty is earned, not inherited. This is the story of the night Freddie Mercury proved that crowns belong to those brave enough to wear them, regardless of bloodlines. The mid-1980s in London was a city suspended between tradition's immovable weight and change's fierce winds. The Victoria Palace Theatre on Victoria Street was one of the capital's grandest venues, a temple of British entertainment that had hosted everyone from variety acts to the greatest performers of generations. Its ornate architecture, its velvet seats, its gilded boxes spoke of an England that prided itself on ceremony, on doing things properly, on knowing one's place. Tonight it was hosting the Royal Variety Performance, one of Britain's oldest and most rigid rituals. An annual charity event held in the presence of members of the royal family, where the country's top entertainers performed for Her Majesty and the assembled aristocracy. It was an honor to be invited, a mark of having truly arrived in British entertainment. But it came with rules. So many rules. Protocol seeped into every square inch of the theater that evening. Who stood where? When you could look at the royal box. How you addressed nobility. What you wore. How you bowed. The acceptable volume of applause. The proper angle of a respectful nod. Centuries of accumulated etiquette compressed into a single evening, where one wrong move could mark you as common, inappropriate, unworthy. The royal box itself loomed over the theater like a gilded throne, a private balcony where members of the royal family sat in splendid isolation, looking down upon both performers and audience with the benign authority of those who'd never questioned their right to such positions. In the stalls below sat the cream of British society, titled nobility, military officers in dress uniforms decorated with medals from wars most of the audience couldn't remember, wealthy patrons in formal evening wear that cost more than most people earned in a year, all of them comfortable in their assigned places in Britain's carefully maintained hierarchy. Backstage, in the ordered chaos of pre-performance preparation, the performers were being briefed by palace advisors, serious men in dark suits, who explained the evening's protocol with the gravity usually reserved for matters of national security. When acknowledging the royal box, one advisor intoned, a modest bow or curtsy is appropriate. Please remember that you are guests at a royal event. Decorum and restraint are expected at all times. The performance should be suitable for all audiences, and any interaction with members of the royal family must be conducted with appropriate deference and respect. Most performers nodded nervously, already mentally rehearsing their bows, checking their outfits for any detail that might be deemed inappropriate, feeling the weight of performing not just for an audience, but for royalty, for history, for the maintenance of British tradition itself. But in Queen's dressing room, tradition was about to meet its match. Freddie Mercury stood before a full-length mirror, putting the finishing touches on an outfit that was designed to be everything the palace advisors had just warned against. He wore what could only be described as a military-style jacket, but not the kind worn by the decorated officers in the stalls. This was Freddie's version. Bright yellow, not subdued navy or traditional black, covered in elaborate gold embroidery, not earned medals but theatrical decoration, cut to fit his body perfectly, not hanging with formal looseness, with epaulettes and frogging that mocked military precision while celebrating theatrical excess. Beneath the jacket, tight white pants that would have scandalized Queen Victoria herself. On his feet, yellow boots that matched the jacket. In his hand, a champagne glass, already half empty, that he had absolutely no intention of putting down before going on stage. His thick, dark mustache was perfectly groomed, his short hair impeccably styled. At 38 years old, he was at the height of his powers, confident, successful, absolutely certain of his worth, and completely unwilling to pretend to be anything other than exactly who he was. Brian May stood nearby, adjusting his own tie for the third time. His white curly hair was neatly styled, his suit was formal and appropriate, his entire appearance screaming, respectful guest who understands protocol. He looked at Freddie's outfit with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Freddie," Brian said quietly, knowing his friend well enough to understand that arguing was probably pointless, but feeling obligated to try anyway. The palace advisors were quite specific in their warnings. They said we need to be very careful when acknowledging the royal box, that we shouldn't go too far, shouldn't draw too much attention, should remember we're guests at a royal event. Freddie turned from the mirror to face Brian directly, his dark eyes showing that familiar mixture of mischief and absolute conviction. "Darling Brian," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive quality that could fill stadiums without amplification. "They may be waiting for their own queen up in that box, but those thousands of people out in those seats, they didn't pay their money to see someone bow and scrape and remember his place. They came to see their queen, their rock and roll royalty. Should I really disappoint them by pretending to be less than I am?" Roger Taylor, sitting in the corner doing final adjustments to his drumsticks, laughed. "Christ, Fred, you're going to give those palace advisors heart attacks." "Good," Freddie said simply. "Someone needs to remind them that the throne they're so busy protecting isn't the only one that matters." John Deacon, always the quiet one, spoke up from where he was checking his bass. "Just don't get us thrown in the Tower of London, yeah?" Freddie grinned. "Oh, darling, I'm far too fabulous for the tower. They'd have to redecorate entirely." The call came. 5 minutes to stage, gentlemen." As they prepared to leave the dressing room, Freddie paused at the mirror one final time. Not to check his appearance, that was perfect, and he knew it, but to look himself in the eyes and remind himself who he was. He was Farrokh Bulsara, born in Zanzibar, raised in India, arrived in England as a refugee with nothing. He'd been mocked for his teeth, for his foreign name, for not belonging. He'd changed his name to Freddie Mercury and built himself into one of the biggest rock stars in the world through talent and will and absolute refusal to accept limitations. And now he was about to walk onto a stage in front of British royalty and aristocracy, and he would be damned if he was going to bow lower than they deserved or pretend to be grateful for permission to exist in their presence. He picked up his champagne glass, a deliberate choice, a small rebellion against the solemn formality of the evening, and walked toward the stage. When the theater's heavy velvet curtains opened, time itself seemed frozen in the Victorian era for those sitting in the royal box and the aristocratic stalls below. The audience was a study in British formality. Women in evening gowns and tiaras, men in white tie and tails, military officers in dress uniforms, heavy with medals and braid. The royal box glittered with the kind of jewelry that represented not just wealth, but centuries of accumulated power and privilege. But when Queen took the stage, that frozen time shattered. Freddie Mercury didn't walk onto the stage like a rock star invited to perform for royalty. He walked on like he owned the place, like the theater was his palace and everyone else, royalty included, was visiting him. The performance was electric. Queen had chosen their set list carefully, big hits that would get the audience moving, songs that were impossible to ignore or dismiss as mere rock and roll noise. They played with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're among the best in the world at what you do. Freddie commanded the stage with his usual feline grace, working the crowd, flirting with the camera, and most notably treating the royal box not with the deference usually shown, but with the easy confidence of an equal acknowledging peers. When he gestured toward the royal box during the performance, it wasn't a nervous glance seeking approval. It was Freddie Mercury, rock royalty, acknowledging other royalty, with the assumption that they were meeting as equals, not as sovereign and subject. The aristocrats in the audience didn't quite know what to make of it. This level of confidence, This refusal to be diminished by the grandeur of the setting, it was unprecedented, slightly shocking, and utterly compelling. When the performance ended, the applause was thunderous. Even the royal box was clapping with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation. Then came the moment that tradition demanded and Freddie had been anticipating: the lineup. After every royal variety performance, the performers lined up on stage to be formally presented to members of the royal family, a receiving line where each performer would be briefly introduced, would bow or curtsy appropriately, might exchange a few words, and would then move on, having received the royal acknowledgement that marked the evening's true purpose. It was the most formal, most protocol-bound part of the entire evening. Palace advisors positioned performers precisely, reminded them of proper forms of address, coached them on appropriate bow depth and eye contact duration. The theater fell into an ice-cold silence as the receiving line formed. Palace officials watched Freddie's every movement like hawks, clearly nervous about what this peacock in yellow and gold might do. Queen stood in line with the other performers, waiting their turn. Brian looked nervous, but composed. Roger seemed amused by the whole ceremony. John, as always, was quietly observing everything. And Freddie stood there with his champagne glass still in hand. He had refused to put it down, claiming it was part of his outfit. His yellow military jacket gleaming under the lights, his posture perfect but not subservient, his expression showing no nervousness whatsoever. As they waited, a high-ranking Duke Elderly, decorated with medals from conflicts most people in the theater couldn't name, representing everything old and established about British aristocracy, approached the line to review the performers before the royal presentation began. He moved down the line, nodding approvingly at appropriately dressed, appropriately deferential performers. Then he reached Freddie. The Duke stopped. His eyes traveled from Freddie's yellow boots up to his elaborately embroidered jacket, lingered disapprovingly on the champagne glass, and finally settled on Freddie's face with an expression that mixed contempt with disbelief. When he spoke, his voice was pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear, loud enough to be insulting but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability of public rudeness. "Mr. Mercury," the Duke said, his accent dripping with generations of inherited privilege and unquestioned authority, "in such a noble setting, one would have expected a rather more modest and protocol-appropriate appearance. This is not a stadium, sir. This is Her Majesty's presence." The other musicians nearby held their breath. Everyone within earshot understood what had just happened. A duke, a representative of the aristocracy, a man whose family had held power for centuries, had just publicly insulted Freddie Mercury, had just reminded him of his place, had just made it clear that rock star or not, he was still common, still inappropriate, still not quite belonging in this rarefied world. For anyone who remembers that era, who understands how British class system worked in the 1980s, this was a devastating putdown. The Duke's words weren't just criticism of an outfit, they were a reminder of hierarchy, of who had the right to judge whom, of invisible but ironclad rules about knowing your place. Most people would have wilted, would have apologized, would have bowed their head and accepted the rebuke from their social superior. Freddie Mercury was not most people. He stopped, turned to face the Duke fully, raised his champagne glass slightly in a gesture that was simultaneously a toast and a dismissal, and looked the Duke directly in the eyes with that penetrating gaze that had commanded stadiums full of people. When Freddie spoke, his voice carried not shouted, not raised inappropriately, but projected with the perfect clarity of someone trained to reach the back row of any venue without amplification. Everyone nearby heard, everyone watching from a distance saw the Duke's face change. Everyone understood that something significant was happening. "Oh, darling," Freddie said, his voice ringing with unshakable confidence and just a hint of amused condescension, as if explaining something obvious to a slow child. "I understand there's been a confusion. You seem to be unclear about which queen is which, sweetheart." He paused, letting that sink in, his eyes never leaving the Duke's face. He gestured gracefully toward the royal box with his champagne glass, "inherited their titles from family trees and accidents of birth. I, however, earned my crown from those people out there. Millions of them. They gave it to me because I deserved it, not because my great-great-grandfather happened to win a battle centuries ago. The Duke's face went ice cold. His mouth opened, then closed. For perhaps the first time in his aristocratic life, he had no response. He'd been expecting deference, apology, acceptance of his superior position. Instead, he'd received a lesson in earned versus inherited authority, delivered with devastating precision. Around them, the careful protocol of the evening cracked like ice on a warming pond. Freddie, having made his point, turned away from the frozen Duke and walked toward where the royal family members were waiting for the formal presentations. As he approached, he did something that no one had dared to do in living memory at such an event. Instead of the deep, formal bow that protocol demanded, the kind that showed appropriate deference and acknowledged the vast gulf between performer and royalty, Freddie gave a nod, just a nod, elegant, respectful, but unmistakably the greeting of an equal to another equal. He looked directly at Her Majesty, something one wasn't supposed to do until given permission, and delivered his acknowledgement with genuine warmth rather than practiced formality. It was sincere, it was gracious, but it was not subservient. A whisper spread through the theater like wildfire. A palace official began to move forward, intending to correct this breach of protocol, but stopped when he saw the expression on the face of the royal family member Freddie was greeting. Was that a smile? The evening had suddenly become about far more than protocol. It had become about two different kinds of authority meeting as equals: inherited versus earned, traditional versus modern, aristocracy versus meritocracy. Because Freddie Mercury had proven something profound that night. Nobility isn't hidden in family tree branches. It's in a person's bearing, their voice, their refusal to accept that they are less than they know themselves to be. He, an immigrant child from Zanzibar, a refugee who'd arrived in England with nothing, someone who'd been mocked for his teeth and his foreign name, and his refusal to hide who he was, had just stood in England's most established venue, faced its aristocracy's cold walls, and demolished them with a single sentence. By the end of the evening, when a slight smile appeared on Her Majesty's face, everyone in that theater understood. That night, two queens had occupied the same room, and Freddie Mercury had declared his sovereignty without needing anyone's permission. Years later, those who remembered that night might not recall exactly what Freddie wore or precisely what he said, but they would never forget what they felt. How one man, facing the highest powers without compromising his own identity, could tower over them all through sheer grace and earned authority. Freddie didn't just sing that night. He taught us that real respect is won through admiration, not fear. That true nobility comes from being authentically yourself, not from following someone else's rules about who you should be. And when those theater lights went down, when the dukes and duchesses returned to history's dusty pages, Freddie's proud stance remained forever hung on those walls, a reminder that crowns belong to those brave enough to wear them, regardless of who their great-great-grandfather happened to be. The immigrant boy from Zanzibar had become royalty, not through inheritance, not through following protocol, not through knowing his place, through talent, through will, through refusing to bow lower than anyone deserved. That night, Freddie Mercury proved what he'd always known. You don't need blue blood to be royal. You just need to be undeniably, unapologetically yourself. And in a room full of people who'd inherited their positions, the man who'd earned his shone brightest of all. Thank you for the crown, darlings. Freddie wore it better than anyone born to it ever could.